Hello, good evening. We are back again tonight with our podcast show. Tonight we have with us Brian Ludmer and Mark, as well as usual. And our focus tonight is to understand much about what we've been fighting for, equal shared parenting. Brian has been one of the lawyers strongly pushing for this shared parenting law to be included in our family law. Um, and I've been sort of following him, reading much about what he's been doing. I believe he was one of the architects behind Bill C-560. He was one of the key, I believe, with Jim Coleman as well, who drafted that bill and presented to our politicians. That bill didn't go too far, but I'm hoping that Brian can shed some light on this bill that was proposed a few years ago and what the next steps are. Mark, anything you want to say before we bring Brian on?
We're just glad to have you here tonight, Brian, and just as we all know, equal shared parenting, how important that is. And so just knowing your involvement and just all the effort that you put forth, really interested to hear, and I know our audience as well would be interested to hear just how you came about, your basically your support, your effort, your knowledge about this and why it's so important. So we'll dig into that all as we get into the podcast tonight. But glad to have you, Brian. Welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to reach out to others who are similarly interested in this extremely important social policy issue.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Brian, for your time tonight. My first question to you is: you've been actively helping to push a legislation on shared parenting. Just for us to understand much about what you've done in the past, are you able to share with the audience where you started and how far you've come with this shared parenting legislation that you've been pushing for so
Sure.
long?
Well, first, I come to this area of law with the perspective of someone who practiced for a couple of decades as a business lawyer, a world that even in its most contentious makes sense, has recognized boundaries and rules. There's a logic to it. And when I myself got separated in 2005 and got exposed to this world, I was quite surprised for something so important, the future of our children and future generations and social policy, to see the unscientific and inconsistent way that such an important social policy was being handled. And so as I dug into it, first in my own case and later as I made the transition helping many others, you could see that there were two paths that needed to be worked on. One was to advance the jurisprudence to each case, and it is a forum that is a learning forum, particularly in Canada, where courts do make reliance on jurisprudence from the other provinces, very unlike the situation in the United States. So if you could truly understand the calculus that the jurisprudential system was bringing to helping families who couldn't otherwise settle their own affairs, there might be an opportunity for better arguments, introducing the science on equal parenting, and otherwise cutting through a lot of the flawed assumptions and the just habitual way that courts had been approaching this. And simply stated, was the habitual way was we look for which parent is going to be the we don't use this language anymore, the custodial parent, the primary parent, the decision-making parent. And so that's what the exercise of perhaps years of litigation leading to a trial was all about, which didn't make a lot of sense to me, because if you had two normal parents, shouldn't the guiding, um, um, maybe assumption is a very loaded word, but the approach be, I got two parents, they're both love their children, they both have their pluses and minuses, they both seem to be interested in parenting, they're reading parenting books, they're taking courses, they really seem to want to help get their kids through this very disruptive period in their life. Doesn't it just end there? So I was asking a lot of rhetorical questions. Here's another one. In an intact family, it's the same two parents. They have their pluses, they have their minuses. Nobody is holding a professorship in family studies at a university. And the state doesn't intervene to say how the family should conduct its affairs, only if something rises to a child protection matter. But suddenly, after separation, we're telling these families that you can't have the closest approximation to what happened before. Two parents, even if somebody is working more than the other parent, they see them every night. They do stuff with them on the weekends. They may talk to them during the day. But we also don't want to regulate how a family conducts its affairs, or else people are just going to insist that both parents work. So the second kind of rhetorical struggle that I had, why are there different rules for separated families than intact families? If you're good enough to be a normal parent, no one's looking over your shoulder while the family is together, why are we suddenly telling you you can only have the kids 37.2% of the time after separation? And I didn't find an answer to that. And then I started arguing these cases, and you research it, and you quickly realize that there's a complete lack of consistency and lack of transparency, and it's just palm tree justice. It's just some blank canvas that somebody who will never meet the family, never see the parent's parent, is going to decide for them. And then you start sitting in on some conferences, and judges are honest, saying, I really wish you guys could settle this yourselves, because a judge is never going to do as good a job as you guys could do yourselves. You know your kids, you know yourselves, you know what everybody's abilities are. Try and settle it yourselves. I'm here only if you can't. So you think about the implications of that. It's a system that readily admits that it's imperfect. We'll never really know. We're here just because somebody's got to make a decision. And we do it with a blank slate and a list of criteria, two competing narratives, a lack of scientific rigor, and we try and figure it out. We do the best we can. So, okay, are there any studies after the fact to see, are judges getting to the right answer? How did it turn out? And of course, there aren't studies. There are no studies we could point to where, say, we take families that either settled for or judicially received equal parenting, and how did things turn out for those kids compared to kids where the system, as it often does, says we're going to make parent A the primary parent. No studies, no scientific rigor. Therefore, no ability for the system to see what it's getting right and what it's getting wrong and self-improve. So there was this slow evolution over time in the jurisprudence as we got younger judges judges who had actually acted for dads, dads who were great parents and really wanted to parent and read books and clearly saw the joy of parenting. And they brought that experience of having advocated for dads like that into the judiciary. So that was starting a change that is still going on. There's certain jurisdictions like Quebec where even culturally, it's okay to have equal parenting. It's not a slight if you're a mom and you agree to equal parenting. In Quebec, you're considered a progressive. Whereas in other jurisdictions, at least the subjective feeling is that, oh, you had to settle because why don't you have the kids more? So that's almost like a cultural thing. It got to a point where there was such a lack of consistency in what the maximum contact principle, historically part of our federal legislation, meant, and it's federal legislation. So whether I'm in Newfoundland or British Columbia, shouldn't it mean the same thing? Shouldn't I be able to predict what that means as a important paradigm in the adjudications? And as I researched it, because I do jurisprudence heavy submissions in my cases, I saw there was a complete lack of consistency. A couple of years back, I actually participated in an application for leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada on just that issue, that the court should take on a case. It was a case out of Alberta dealing with the maximum contact principle because courts across the country, courts of appeal across the country, were demonstrably applying it in different ways. That crucial piece of federal legislation meant different things at different times in different provinces, and then we even showed inconsistency within provinces. Nobody knows. It's a conceptual thing that is meant to have real meaning that you just don't know. So despite all the progress we've made, and I don't want to minimize it, because those of us who advocate for equal parenting see the law moving in this direction. It's slow. And for those of us like Jean Coleman and myself, our careers are not, perpetual, if you will. We had to have another approach at the same time if over the term of our practice, we were really going to see change. So over the years, you make contact with the organizations that are advocating for legislative change. One of the pioneers, you may have had him on your show, Glenn Sheridan from the Canadian Equal Parenting Coalition. And there are many other organizations, the United States National Parents Organization, formerly called Fathers and Families, very, very active. It then acted as the catalyst for the International Council for Shared Parenting. And so bit by bit by bit, I got involved with all of these groups. I'm on two of the committees for the International Council of Shared Parenting, the Scientific Committee and the Training Committee. And I'll be a plenary speaker at their annual conference that will be held in Greece this coming year. Just to touch on some of these broad-based issues and see how far the legislation can actually take us. How far does the jurisprudence take us? And then we're going to need legislative change to get us further, it would seem. So through these groups, I was connected with some people who devote an immense amount of time to the cause that you guys are publicizing. And And there have been various attempts to lobby the federal parties in Canada, some attempts at a provincial level as well. And your listeners, viewers, might be familiar with the name Maurice Vellacott. He was a backbencher out of Saskatchewan, and he devoted the 20 years of his service in Parliament. This was one of his projects, and various draft bills were proposed. And I got involved around 2014. And I saw what they had been trying to put through is a bit too complicated. It was trying to accomplish too many different things. And we really needed to simplify it to its core element. So the challenge in the legislative amendments to deal with this, and you can see it successfully implemented in some of the states in the United States that I'm sure your viewers, you've probably had other podcasts describing. There's now 6 states, I think, that have a legislative reform to some extent in this, and the momentum is clearly there at the state level in the states. So what I did was I took what they had been working with prior to my involvement, and I have to simplify this, have to take this down to just its core principle, because that would help to sell it. And then, so what's it supposed to say? If it's automatic equal parenting, it's going to mean a lot of resistance. And even I could see that it wasn't workable in all cases. And the examples I would give people is mom's an investment banker and she's traveling on assignments and stuff like that. And I know that world because I came from that world. It's not going to work. I mean, the demands of those assignments are quite demanding, and you can't say to your employer, I'm not prepared to travel on a regular basis outside Toronto. It just doesn't work. So, and then you have people with very complicated shift work that often we can accommodate still within equal parenting. Or you may have people who are struggling with substance abuse and things of that sort. There's obviously no end to the variability in families. So it seemed to me that if the approach was mandatory 50-50, with only a delineated list of exceptions, it was going to be a tough sell. So I needed to come up with some language that would do the trick and yet not be at risk from, because that's the number one pushback, that you can't have mandatory 50-50 in all cases. So the first principle was it couldn't be mandatory. It could be a presumption, right? In other words, it's the starting point. It is the paradigm, but it has to be rebuttable. Somebody has substance abuse problems. Somebody travels on business all the time. Whatever the issue is, you can't prescribe all those exceptions. Families are too variable. What we were after was whatever the number is, 85%, 90% of the family law litigation is two normal parents where somebody wants to be the dominant parent and the other parent is resisting that despite the uncertainties of our judicial adjudication process. And so we have our courts clogged up with people fighting over, is it 50-50? Is it 60-40? Is it 65-35? A relatively narrow bracket. And I looked at that and I said, you're going to have a family in turmoil. The system is going to spend a fortune. The family is going to spend a fortune. For what? And can you really tell? Where's the science for somebody to say, I've heard this case, I've figured it out, and mom or dad, the sweet spot in this family, you should see the kids 37.2% of the time. And obviously, there's no science to that. You're either a safe, competent parent within the realm of normal or not. So that didn't make a lot of sense. So eventually, what I came up with is what I described as a steep but not insurmountable hill. There would be a presumption of equal parenting. It would be rebuttable, but it would be very tough to rebut it, but it would be open-ended. I can't prescribe the circumstances that might rebut it because they're almost infinite. And it seemed to me that that would deal with that 80 to 90% of cases that are being litigated that shouldn't be litigated because fundamentally it's two normal parents. Don't worry, kids will be fine. They don't need 37.2 and 62.7, whatever the number is. They'll live 50-50. Everybody's going to be fine. It's the reduction in the conflict, the reduction in the fighting will benefit the kids more than some unscientific approach trying to figure out where it is in that very narrow zone. That informed the drafting of what became Bill C-560 in around 2015. And we took that as far as second reading. We were trying to get it into committee. We felt if we could get it into committee and people studied it and we could bring the scientists in to speak to it, we would have a shot. But it did not have the support. It was a conservative government at the time. And to our surprise, it didn't have the support of the government. So that meant under the rules that they follow, when it's directed, all the cabinet ministers have to vote against it. But we got the vast majority of the conservative backbenchers. So we got about 80 votes and we needed 120 something. But it certainly shook the tree, got the issues out there, and we kind of just circled the wagons and we're going to wait for our next opportunity. So the next opportunity was, of course, the Liberal government making changes to Canada's federal divorce legislation for the first time in a meaningful way since it was introduced back in 85, 86. It's a long time. A lot of social changes have gone on since. So many of us, many organizations wanted to get involved and have their voice heard on the issue of equal parenting. And there were at least 15 presentations, of which mine was one, at the House of Commons committee meetings, where they were studying the government bill, which was beefing up domestic violence provisions and making other changes to mobility, getting rid of language of custody parent and access parent. So there was a lot that was commendable in the bill. But at the end of the day, were you still going to have the same amount of really brutal litigation with kids as pawns in the middle and uncertainty in the family and draining the family of financial resources? Yeah. The changes that were made, the lengthy changes, didn't actually tackle the fundamental problem of the structure of the system and the thinking in the first place. Now, when the matter was being studied in committee, hence the presentations and invited speakers. And you can't just walk in there. You apply and they vet you and they see who you represent, that sort of thing. So we were persuasive enough that the conservative members of that House of Commons committee moved an amendment, the very test that I had crafted back in 2014, 2015. So there were two conservative members of that House of Commons committee, and they moved it, but the Liberals had majority of that committee and weren't supporting that. And so that amendment did not pass. So it then moves to the Senate. And the Senate only took a few invited witnesses. I was one of them. So this time I spoke on behalf of several of the organizations at the Senate and kind of made the same sort of pitch, why a rebuttable presumption of equal parenting made sense, reduced litigation, reduced stress on families, reduced the conflict to the children was going to be markedly reduced. It would free up resources for those complex cases where there are addictions or there is domestic violence. There'd be more resources in the court system available to it. It just made so much sense on so many different levels. And it was also in accordance with the science we were presenting. The science over the years had evolved to become definitive that this made sense from the point of view of social policy. We introduced the science. We had some of the social scientists themselves testifying. But this is an inherently political process. And the Liberal government didn't see the constituency that they should have been focusing on, which is the public generally. And instead, it was who could, in effect, at least notionally, speak the loudest. So who was speaking the loudest, and given the tenor of the times, was the domestic violence community. Now, this had always been a paradigm of our law, best interests and protection from harm. We now have much more detailed provisions, but it's not protecting children from the harm of their parents litigating over their future in the first place. It's just not designed for that. The principal voice against equal parenting was, not surprisingly, the Canadian Bar Association. But just to show you how the government didn't understand its constituencies, there were two representatives of the Canadian Bar Association. One was representing the family law section. The other one was representing the child protection section. Those are the two big areas of family law. So, but when they spoke, they said, we represent whatever it was, whatever number they used. I think it was something like 36,000 lawyers across the country. And that's wrong. No, they don't. They are only two of multiple sections of the Canadian Bar Association. The business law section, the immigration law section, the real estate law section, the tax law section, on and on, are educated people, many of whom have repartnered or have friends or family who have repartnered and don't make their living from this process, and are certainly much more likely to be actually in support of equal parenting, particularly if they've ever personally gone through the system or a close family member has gone through the system. So they certainly were not speaking for lawyers across the country. But again, that fact gets lost. So one of the other things I brought, because it's a political process as opposed to a scientific process, it should be a political process founded on the science. But if the political process means that you're taking into account the will of the people, we brought in 20 years of public opinion polling in Canada that consistently has said across all demographics, by gender, by age, by region, by political affiliation, whatever demographic slice you want to look at, there was very substantial support for equal parenting. And by that, I mean above 80% of decided people. There's always like this category of 10 or 12% who really haven't been thinking about it. And so when they're caught in the polling, they're put down as undecided because they don't have an opinion on the issue. But of decided voters in any domain, any way you slice it in Canada, consistently for all polling done over the last several decades, there is overwhelming support for equal parenting. And I tried to make that point that you guys think because you're on this committee and you're going to hear from a bunch of special interest groups that you're the experts and you can advise Parliament on this and you can advise the ruling party on this. But you're not the experts. The experts are the people out there who live with this system. They're the experts. They know why it doesn't work. They know how it doesn't work. They know where and how it needs to be improved. And you're not listening to them. And you're supposed to be listening to them. So I can explain as a lawyer why the system isn't working because it's fundamentally not structured appropriately. It says it is advancing the best interests of children, but in practice, it doesn't. And I can go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, so Brian, you covered a lot. Great stuff. You obviously are a strong advocate, and with knowledge and expertise into, the dynamics behind all of this. I want to get back in a second to the science that you talk about of equal shared parenting. But you mentioned some other things too. You mentioned about the fact that, there's, well, unfortunately, a competition that is created, right? Whereas, as you mentioned, okay, prior to divorce, it's like, okay, there's no there's no involvement of the, the court, the government, whatever, in that family. And I saw something I posted in my group just this last week is like, from a father's perspective, because we know the stats there of who usually gets the child and or gets the custody of the child and how the child support and all that dynamics work. So you got a father that was married and now they find themselves no longer married for whatever reasons. And now they're having to basically like go and spend money and make their case and do all this stuff where when they were married and in a intact family, they could just be a father and they had their rights. And unfortunately, you go to court and you give up these rights that are constitutional rights, constitutional here in the United States, but these rights that you have just because you are a parent. And all of a sudden now you're having to spend money to explain why you are a good parent and like nothing changed except there was a divorce. And now you've got the courts and you've got all this, all these other special interests. Another thing, we in Texas had very similar processes you mentioned here, where we had 200 just about a year ago, 200 people go and talk down in Austin to the reasoning behind equal shared parenting, and they wouldn't vote it out of committee. 200, that included women and that included children, explaining why equal shared parenting was in the best interest. And yet you had the family law and you had certain interests of attorneys, certain ones that wouldn't vote it out, even though they know the reasoning and the rationale of why it's better. So, you know, it's just this system that is so broken and is so controlling in the aspects of it. They want in it feels like here in the United States and in the States here, it's almost like they want a winner and loser. Now I know they say you guys should mediate this and everything, but if you can have a winner and a loser, then there's a lot of money that flows through the system. But we can touch on that, but I also want you to touch on that science of equal shared parenting, because we know that everything points to a 50-50, like you said, on just the base. And then if there's any other reasons why it shouldn't be, well, that's the rare exception. But the 50-50, we got study after study that shows it's best for the kids.
Yeah. So there's, once again, decades of that sort of research. And sitting on the scientific committee of the International Council for Shared Parenting, I have access to it all. And we had a tough time coming up with a top 100 list because there's so much good science on this around the world. But you have to make it accessible. So we had this massive database with every paper we could find in multiple languages as well. And then there's a top 100 list and top 25 list. So that science is not well understood. And in many quarters, they don't want to know about it. They'd rather bury their head in the sands, because if they paid attention to the science, it would influence public policy. So that's a problem. And there are difficulties, by the way, in introducing social science into a legal adjudication. It can only be done through an expert, which means on top of it all, instead of the system learning from the science, it'll do so iteratively from case after case, but only people who can go to the trouble and the expense of retaining somebody to come and testify about the science. So it's a further hurdle. In Canada, because you mentioned several times about the right of a parent that somehow gets lost after separation, you do have a constitutional right to be a parent. In Canada, the challenge is even deeper because we don't have that right. Our Supreme Court said back in the late 70s that it's all just about the children. The children have rights. The parents don't have rights. The only time it's a challenge in terms of constitutionally a parent's rights is if it's a child protection case, because then it's the state against the parent. But in a battle between the two parents, the only one who has rights in Canada is the child. Parents have rights, say, of due process, procedural fairness, but you can't say that you're impinging on my right to parent, at least as we have it now. So there are all of these challenges. We know what the answers are, and we know what the current system is doing to families who come through it, and in its current form is not assisting in settlements. The system only works, doesn't have the capacity if everybody litigates. It counts on 90% plus of cases settling, but they settle today, some for equal parenting if there's a progressive attitude on both sides, but an awful lot on the basis that because the lawyer's honest, says to the client, you're looking at a 3 to 4 year battle. It's going to cost you X by the time it's done. And I can't sit here today and tell you you're going to be successful at the end. And your life will be completely kind of overshadowed by this pending litigation at all times. So a lot of people just take an expedient route, even though they know they can make a contribution as much as the next parent, and the children therefore don't benefit. So whatever the issue is that is being argued, or whatever the jurisprudential concern is, we have science on it. People just have to reach out and ask, and we can make that science accessible. So a lot of it is educating, and a lot of it is advocacy, because I think we need to keep the pressure up on the legislatures. And the saddest part of all is that there's several generations of kids that are being affected here by conflict, which is the one certainty, that the uncertainty in the conflict and the lobbying of the kids that happens in every single case is significantly negatively affecting the kids. And equal parenting is one way to make it go away. Just, sorry, I know you think you're a better parent, but the other parent is normal, good enough. You're going to have to put up with equal parenting, move on with your life. And, after a while, that would really bring the litigation down. When we look at the states in the United States that have taken that leap, we do see the litigation trending down. Interestingly, we even see false allegations trending down. It's an environment of peace, that is, because everybody knows, unless there's something extraordinary, that's what the result is going to be. So why fight? Just accept it. It's a societal value proposition, equal parenting. It's a social imperative. Accept it, move on, repartner, build a life. Don't divert yourself into this war, because it won't be successful at the end of the day. All of a sudden, we've got floods of settlements. So if the actual experience is positive, the science is definitive, the public, everywhere we look, including all the polling that NPO does in the States, the public wants it. What's the problem? Why are we still here? Why are we having to do this podcast? The answer, to some extent, is political and lack of education about everything that I said. It's almost like, guys, the war's over. It's been decided. Wake up, see what I'm saying, stop fighting this. But there are certain interest groups that won't let go. In some cases, like I believe Florida, they've had several attempts where it comes through the legislature, it's all set to go, and the governor won't sign the bill in because of some last-ditch lobbying, which is really unfortunate. But I think, the overall trend is not only positive, but inevitable. You're not going to see jurisdictions try equal parenting, say it didn't work, so we're going to get rid of it. The special interest groups will point to Australia. They'll say, oh, they had equal parenting and it didn't work, and so they got rid of it. Not true. They never had what I described as equal parenting. They amended their legislation in the early 2000s to make it more balanced. And then there were changes a decade or so later brought on by the domestic violence lobbying community, where they watered it down a bit. But it was not because of any sort of negative experience with more balanced parenting plans. It was simply a political process. So the best test is in the United States, in those states that have brought it in. And what is the experience? Give it a try for 3, 4, 5 years. Check your stats. Do some updated public opinion polling. If the experience is good and the litigation is coming down and the vehemence of the disputes is also coming down, then you know you're onto something good, and it's just roll right out across the states. So I'm gratified in this journey that I've been on to have met people like you guys. Thank you for hosting me, and the people behind NPO and the people behind the other organizations in Canada, volunteering their time for the greater good of our children. Very, very committed, and you're all going to be successful at the end of the day. The saddest part is we'll have yet another generation of children who had to go through all this conflict for the inevitable result.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, equal parenting is going to be pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes so much sense on so many levels. And how many kids are going to be affected, and their kids therefore get affected by the way we're doing things now. That, to me, is the saddest part of this, because every child lost is a precious loss. But if you guys keep doing what you're doing and educating, and public awareness, and everybody else involved in this cause does what they're doing, almost every one of which is volunteering their time, this will inevitably be successful. And we will all be able to look back on this afterward as some of the finest days of our life, a legacy that we will all be proud of. So I commend you guys for devoting your time to this cause.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I have a question on YouTube from Gavin Macmillan, and it reads, "What did the amendment to C-78 say that was so objectionable that it failed in 2014? As a follow-up, does a rebuttable presumption of equal shared parenting increase frequency of false accusations?" You may have answered part of it already, but it's a question.
Okay, it's a great question. So back in 2014, the pending bill was C-560, and there was nothing in it that was objectionable. It was exactly as I drafted it, narrow enough, single issue focus that it could have advanced. It failed simply because it did not have the political support. It had the public opinion support, but it didn't have the political support necessary to get it into committee where it would have some legs. That was it. It just nothing objectionable about it. Just it was a social policy change that the backbenchers were all in favor of in the Conservative Party, but it did not have the core part of the party. And actually, there is an interesting anecdote. I had a meeting with one of the senior cabinet members. I won't mention names, but he was actually the local MP for where I live. But it was after the fact, or no, actually, it was during the process. But I got to him after Harper had directed his cabinet not to support it, and so that had about a half-hour meeting, left him with a binder of materials, and he was very frank with me. Said, "I wish you'd gotten to me about 4 or 5 months earlier."
Hmm.
This was a senior cabinet member. Said, I would have brought this to the cabinet's attention. I would have spoken, and this may have gone in another direction. But in the agenda of the government of the day, this sort of social policy thing, because they didn't understand the broader implications for how many kids are being damaged and the $10 billion a year it's wasting and that sort of thing. So it just not a sexy issue. It was not something that the broader cabinet felt merited their time. So the actual decision not to support it was made by senior bureaucrats in the Department of Justice, advising the then Justice Minister that no, we don't think this is good policy. And then he reports it to the cabinet that no, I don't think this is something we should support. And so they don't support. Like it's sad to say that it was that kind of circuitous and non-robust a route for something so important, but it was just that simple. That's why it didn't work at the time. Now, let's say the second part of the question that's on the screen. So we do get it in. So now people who are dead set on being the dominant parent know that if they play fair, they're not, it's going to be 50-50. So the question then raises the issue, is this then going to give incentive to people to not play fair, to start to raise false allegations? I can say based on my experience that the type of person who would make a false allegation, they're making it today. They're making it today, they'll make it then. All we can do with those people is be very harsh when we find that they've made a false allegation, because that's child abuse. That's going to expose the child to invasive interviews, which are going to inferentially mention or message rather that one parent is a risk. It damages the attachment. So no, I don't see that being a relevant risk, because there's a lot of people who really feel strongly that their interest group should always be the dominant parent, but that doesn't mean they're actually going to make a false allegation, as opposed to just give a lot of examples, so to speak, of why they think they're better, they're calmer, they're nicer, they've always done it, all the more conventional things. But those arguments are not going to work with a rebuttable presumption of equal parenting. So the question is, are people just going to resign themselves as they have in the jurisdictions where we see litigation coming down, or the couple of Scandinavian jurisdictions where this has always been normal and they don't see this type of vicious litigation?
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I think one, false accusations, there needs to be stronger consequences. So that's the way to make sure that we, I guess, reduce those false accusations. Is at least here in the States, it seems like there's no consequences, so they can freely give that. And if a person is wanting to do that, they're going to do it either way. But because you're starting out on a level playing field and you're saying there's nothing to gain, so one, if you do the false accusation, there's bigger consequences, but there's not a lot to gain. You can sit here and say, oh, well, I don't like the way they don't comb the kid's hair in the morning or whatever. Okay, all right, but that has nothing to do with whether they're a good parent or not. So you can sit here all day long and just make all these other things and even try a false accusation. But you at the end of the day, it's going to have to be supported by evidence after evidence. And there's quite possible that by doing that, it should come back to bite you, and you're the one doing the child abuse because you're the one doing the false accusation. So if there's not much to gain and there's more to lose by doing that, people are just going to just leave it alone. And guess what? Kids are going to prosper. Everyone's going to be happier. You're going to move on with your life. And so a lot of times, right, these kind of questions will come up like, oh, well, it's going to encourage more fighting. No, it's really not, because because right now it's starting out as a winner and a loser. If you're starting out as you're both winners, then there's a lot more effort you got to put forth. But when there's a winner and a loser and the stats, quite frankly, are teetered towards the women, well, then all they got to do is just make something that a judge is going to say, or some expert or something going to say, oh yeah, okay, all right, okay, because they were already going to give, the women were already probably going to get it in most cases, or one parent was going to get over the other. So then now it's just an easy sell versus there's just not a lot to gain. And that's the part that we see in the States they're fighting so hard against. And when I say they, everybody in the system, all the politics and stuff, because at the end of the day, the stats show, back to the science, how fathers involved in their kids' lives and both parents involved, right? We're not taking one over the other, but there's a lot of evidence that says fathers involved in their kids' lives are going to keep them out of jail, are going to keep them off drugs, all that stuff. They need that influence. So
Correct.
that's what
Extremely well said, and it's reflected. I funded the 2017 public opinion poll in Canada, and then the recent 2021 public opinion poll in Canada, and just same thing. The public gets it.
Yeah.
Yet again, if anything, the results are trending toward even more positive support for equal parenting.
Yeah.
So those are the experts, the people who have to live with the system, but they're also the consumers. They're the clients of the system. We should listen to them because they know. And it's just a matter of elevating this, the urgency and the deep implications of this issue have to be understood by the politicians. And when they do, and when if they are prepared to spend the time to see our public opinion polling over that long a time period, somebody's going to be bold enough to say, I don't care about the special interest groups. I will ride the vast majority of public opinion that this is a good thing.
Yeah.
So we have a chance now. I don't think we're ever going to convince this Liberal government of the merits of this. We'll keep trying, but we have a new Conservative leader, and I think many of us have come to understand that it's real tough to get a private members bill through. And we need the government of the day to make this, if they can see that it's a vote generator for them, then the science is there, the logic is there, and we'll get it through. So we have all the tools. It's just a matter of pulling it all together, getting somebody who matters to really buy in. And as I said, there's a new Conservative leader. We got an opportunity now. That party's platform, the broader, less detailed document, does seem to contemplate equal parenting as a value proposition. But frankly, I think so did the Liberals' broad-based policy document as opposed to detailed policy documents. So we'll keep trying. You have to keep trying in all these different venues, keep publicizing the successes, show how happy people are in jurisdictions that have enacted the legislative change, and then it'll be self-reinforcing. Barbara Kay wrote a series of articles for us over the 2014 period and subsequent. We need to interest another generation of journalists in this issue because it's a meaningful social policy issue. I'm working with one of Canada's major newspapers on a multi-day, multi-page investigative journalism piece on parental alienation, which they see as a very interesting thing for an investigative journalism piece. Well, why isn't equal parenting? I mean, obviously we're going to have a little pitch in there that one way to reduce the risk of parental alienation is to have equal parenting as the starting point, which brings me to one other thing. If you don't get equal parenting at any time along the way prior to your trial, so you haven't tried it. Shouldn't it be mandatory? And this is what Kentucky did, by the way, the first U.S. state to bring the full thing. They enacted it first that on separation, it's a rebuttable presumption of equal parenting, but the trial would be a little bit less boundary driven. And so that led to a lot of families experiencing equal parenting where they might not have even had the opportunity. Then they say, hey, this isn't so bad. And then they would settle for equal parenting. So after about a year or so, they amended the legislation for the back half. Seems to be working well. We put our toe in the water with that first piece. Seemed to be working well. Now we'll go the rest of the way. So even that piece, you're deciding against equal parenting for a particular family that has never tried equal parenting. How can you do that? So there's all these great arguments, and it's just a matter of at some point the persuasiveness of all of these pieces will come together in the right person's hands with the right timing at just that moment. And maybe we're there now. We'll see.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I truly appreciate all your efforts, your commitment, to this fight. I think you're one of the few people that I've come to find out tonight that you are really doing a lot behind the scenes that many of us did not know about. But I have one more last question for you,
Sure, please.
Brian. Um, One of the things that at least That's Mother 2 started doing as of last week was to start small groups across the country, both at the provincial levels, the municipalities, having small chapters. And the intent with these small chapters is to continue to raise awareness, educate people on what's truly happening. Because if you have not gone through uh, divorce or separation, you wouldn't really know that this is happening. We've had people on the show that did not really know that this is happening in our communities. And so the idea is to continue to raise awareness, educate people, let people know that this is what's happening. Because, as you said, politicians understand votes more than the social issues that we have. So we want to be able to turn this into real votes for them to understand that what there are people out there that want to see change, and the ones that are suffering are the children. From a strategy point of view, what would be your advice? What direction do you think it would be best for us, to move this and to support your initiatives as well?
Um, I like the small local group idea because then um, there's commonality in terms of maybe your local newspaper would do a story and local community centers host things. Um, but you wind up with a lot of duplication of effort. Like the stuff takes time, and a lot of the small groups wouldn't know about other resources, other arguments, other things that other small groups have already done. So when you look at who has been successful with social change, it has been well organized province-wide or statewide or national organizations with local chapters. So they share knowledge, they share resources, they speak with a collective voice, but you have volunteers on the ground within their own communities who can speak to their local MP, their local MPP. So um, for the US listeners, their local member of the House of Representatives, their local senator, be it at a state level or federal level. Um, that, in my experience, has worked best. The two complement each other, having local chapters, but being part of a broader national organization, so that there isn't a lot of duplication. And people, they volunteer time for a while, then you lose them. Um, they have other pressing issues in their lives. So where you're part of a broader national organization, even as the volunteers at a chapter level are turning over, because that's just the way it goes. Um, you still have that sort of continuity. So that would be my advice.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. Any final thoughts from you?
Brian, we just appreciate you being here and just sharing, like I said, like I mentioned a couple of times, your knowledge and your advocacy. especially up there in Canada. We like to have you down here in the States doing the same. Fortunately, we also have a lot of great people champion the cause between all of our different groups that are involved. We have quite a few of them now, and they're just growing, and they're just building on each other, and then to be engaged with you guys in Canada too. I mean, like you said, it's just a matter of time. It may not happen in our kids' generation. I do hope that it does. There's no reason why it can't even happen in some, like I say, Texas, for example. I mean, it should have happened last year, and I think this next year we had 200. I think we're gonna have 400. I mean, they had to go all through the night, and hey, we may have to go through the next morning to hear everyone give their little presentation. And it's just going to be something that, like you said, it's like they're like, okay, we give whatever it is, right? But for the good of the kids. And I think we just keep it up, and we just let them know we're not going anywhere. I think we're getting a lot of high profile cases right now too, with things like Johnny Depp, and there's a lot of docuseries and stuff that are going to be created. You're going to see come out. I mean, this is getting awareness. Now the question is, will they just continue to ignore it? And like you said, well, guess what? Then when it comes up to voting time, they're going to be, well, you didn't do anything about this. You guys weren't interested. We told you this is best for the kids. I mean, again, you look at all the stats, and the fact of father's not. It's always father not being in the kid's house, life, or in the house, and that's why this tragic thing happened. Well, again, yes, it makes a difference. It makes a difference for both parents to be in the kid's life, and for that stability for the kid to have. And 50-50 only makes sense. So it's not going away. We're not going away. So eventually they're going to cry uncle, and we're going to get this solved.
Yeah. I'll just leave you with one more thought. When the kids themselves get interviewed in their early 20s, almost inevitably they say, I never understood any of what was happening. Why couldn't they have just had two equal homes? So there's another constituency that we should be listening to.
Absolutely. That's a good point.
Okay. And Brian, just any last words from you?
I just want a shout out. Yeah, sure. Just a shout out, because Mark's in the States. We have Glenn Sheridan and CPC in Canada trying to act as an omnibus. You got National Parents Organization is doing tremendous work, and is attempting to have chapters within each state. And then, of course, the state organization has to try and get chapters in each major municipality. So use them. Their resources are tremendous. Their websites are great. In Canada, we have Lawyers for Shared Parenting that Gene and I founded. In the States, you have Terry Brennan and Leading Women for Shared Parenting, with a tremendous amount of resources on his website. So if it's all dispersed, we don't maximize the import of all of this. So I just always encourage everybody to let the major organizations know about your own organization, get on their mailing lists, ask, maybe MPO doesn't have a chapter in, I'll just pick a state at random, in Wyoming. So they would love to hook up with a local, in that example, Wyoming organization, and have them part of the platform. So let's do that. Let's all keep talking.
Yeah, we're stronger together. Stronger together, for sure.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Brian. I
My
truly
pleasure.
appreciate all your work, and I really admire you for what you're doing. We are doing our part as well. You have a force behind you, and we are, making some noise, and we'll be making some more noises. So
Great.
We truly appreciate your effort, and we would love to have you back again in the future.
Oh, my pleasure. And I would hope to be able to report on further evolution of the jurisprudence, and some interesting developments in the political process.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate that.
Thanks,
I'm
Brian.
just going to play the outro, and then I'll join you.